Hello and welcome everybody. Welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. On this week's episode, we are breaking down the top 16 from Mox Masters July 2023. This is the most recent in the Mox Masters tournament. We're leading up to that Mox Masters Invitational in October of this year. So things are looking pretty crazy with that. I think I'm really excited to participate in that tournament and, see all the people who are qualifying by continuing to do well in these tournaments. So it's some really exciting stuff. We have some crazy decks from today. Some of the most variants in the top 16, just a lot of really cool decks, a really surprising back-to-back result here that I'm not going to spoil too much, but there's a lot of really cool stuff happening with this tournament, and a lot of players who are starting to have their name in the equation doing really, really well and having repeated success at these Mox Masters tournaments. So without any further ado, let's start to get right into those. But before we do, make sure while you're here on YouTube to hit like and subscribe. It helps out the channel a ton. Check out patreon.com/comedianmtg. Any support there helps out the channel a lot. This is now my full-time gig, so any support you can help out with over at Patreon is huge for me and for the channel. And finally, we offer cEDH coaching here on the channel. You can hit me up there at comedianmtg@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter or Discord. Find me at any of those places if you want to inquire about that. Now let's jump on in. So I didn't get to participate in this Mox Masters tournament, so it was really cool to see the wrap up afterwards and see what decks were doing really well. And we have a repeat top 16 here with the Kings Kitten by PTD. This deck did pretty well at the last Mox Masters, and it's basically a Kenrith mid-range combo deck. We've got, Teferi here with Displacer Kitten, which is sort of what I'm assuming the origin of the names of this deck comes from, but there's also a Lurrus in there as well. And we have several, overlapping and layered combos here that can really start to create infinite mana and pump it into our Kenrith. So obviously Teferi, Time Raveler, plus Displacer Kitten, plus any 0 mana rock or rock that adds more mana than it costs. So for example, something like a Chrome Mox, LED, Lotus Petal, Mana Crypt, and Soul Ring will work for this Mox time. It won't because you would need to pitch a land every single time. But any of those allow you to play Teferi, bounce the rock with Teferi, play the rock, and then repeatedly bounce it over and over again and get infinite Displacer Kitten triggers, as well as being able to draw your deck. We also have some other Displacer Kitten combos in this deck here. With Lurrus or Eternal Witness and Lotus Petal and Lion's Eye Diamond, you enter a scenario in which you are able to play the LED, crack the LED, play the petal, flicker either Lurrus or the Eternal Witness, get back the other mana rock that you had to sacrifice, and those are actually infinite combos as well. So it seems like there's a very heavy Displacer Kitten focus with this deck, not to mention the insane synergy it has with Dockside Extortionist as well. So this is definitely got like the vibe of a Dawnwaker style deck, but obviously using black to give you access to Mayhem Devil, Lurrus, Bowmasters, Lotho, and a number of other powerful things like these Black Tutors and stuff like that, Consultation, Thassa's Oracle. So the deck's definitely running this mid-range plan, but having the ability to pivot into a more, turbo ad nauseum style focus and or utilize the, benefits that black gives you. Now, there is no actual ad nause in the list, as I was saying, but the play patterns of the payoffs are similar. So right, so we're playing something like Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation as a payoff, and also we have our Underworld Breach combos here with Underworld LED and Brain Freeze. So no ad nause present in the list, but a lot of the pieces that you would normally find in like an ad nause Kenrith are also here, and this is the list that I pointed out Cloud Shift last time we looked at it. A lot of people said it's really good for Gilded Drake synergies, allowing things to like return to your control, back under your control, obviously Flicker's Dockside and stuff like that. So yeah, very solid mid-range Kenrith list. A lot of the direction that a lot of the mid-range Kenrith decks have been sort of focused on moving into this modern era of cEDH, but this one definitely having a heavy focus on Displacer Kitten combos. We have No Blocks Please by Super Rad B. This is a Yuriko deck, and I haven't really been covering Yuriko decks a lot on this channel except for when we covered the Fishbowl last year. So it's really cool to see another Yuriko put up results. It's one of those decks that like a lot of people truly enjoy it, but I feel like I never actually see it get the W, get the top 16, get the win. So it's really cool to see Yuriko pilot do really well here. We got a 29 lander, which is kind of surprising seeing how low the curve is for most Yuriko decks, but there's also a ton of free spells and things like that. One of the main benefits, in my opinion, of playing Yuriko is that you get to play this whole suite here. Being able to play Null Rod and Curse Totem in the same deck shuts down a lot of the grindier stuff in the format. Not only that, but Weathered Runestone and Grafdigger's Cage on top of all of that really ensure that your opponents are not doing the most busted things that their decks can be doing. And then when the game gets kind of fair, beating in with flyers, making them them into ninjas and dealing your opponents a ridiculous amount of damage, turns out that actually does get your opponents pretty dead. So this deck is pretty interesting and very cool to see another Yuriko do well. You know, you can see a lot of the things here that are classic Yuriko staples, which are like free spells that have ridiculously high mana costs when they're trying to be regular cast. You know, basically the Black Force Will here, that's a removal spell. We have Actual Force, Deadly Relic, Mindbreak Trap, Snuff Out, you know, all these very, very heavy mana cost cards that, you know, when they're hit by Yuriko triggers, do a lot of damage. I think 11, the 15 here from the Shadow Mortality seems to be the highest mana value in the whole deck, which is, you know, a solid 15 off of one Yuriko trigger is definitely nothing to scoff at. And then, you know, there's a lot of other really cool stuff. And like the cool part about Yuriko is always trying to balance, you know, what your opponents are doing with what your deck can be doing as well. I also see that Orcish Bowmasters is in this list, a new addition to the format and a new addition to this list. And I'm wondering if how much of an impact this actually has had for Yuriko. Like, is it clearing blockers? Is it actually allowing the deck to sort of get a bit of an advantage, or is it just like a nice value piece for the deck? All in all, super rad. Congrats on getting in the top 16 with this Yuriko deck. It's not an easy deck to top 16 with nowadays, and to see it do that is pretty sweet. This is Man Bear Pig by Snack. We have a Tivit list, and I believe this is a pilot whose name I have said before on this channel. This is a pretty run-of-the-mill Tivit list, just sort of, you know, as we mentioned in the last video, this list is just doing a lot of the stuff that Tivit likes to do. We're trying to get mana engines down, we're trying to get card advantage engines down, we're trying to have pieces that tempo out your opponents, like Blind Obedience, which I think I mentioned on this series before, but I find it to be like one of the least cuttable pieces in all of Tivit. And then we have things like the One Ring, which is one of the newest additions apart from Bowmasters, that allows you to really start drawing a lot of cards when you get into these grindy mid-range games. You know, Tivit gets you a lot of value, but also mana is not hard to come by in this deck. You don't play ad nauseum usually, so it's pretty free to just be able to play this One Ring, and then as the game gets longer and longer, you really start to just snowball out of control with this deck. So the One Ring I think is a really solid include in here as well. I don't have it in my current list, but I definitely will be putting one in there for sure. Word of Invention's always a card I find a little awkward in Tivit just because of the fact that you still have to pay the triple blue, but I think the card's still pretty solid and definitely gets you your time save when you need it, so that part's pretty cool. Apart from that, nothing too insane. Definitely seeing, you know, the addition of these 3 new Lord of the Rings cards with Bowmasters, Lotho, and our One Ring, but apart from that, same old Tivit doing the thing where it keeps showing up and keeps placing in the top 16, keeps, you know, top 4ing, winning tournaments, and Tivit's just, you know, here to stay, I definitely think. Now we have Petals on Linen, colorized by Aya. This is a Najeela deck, and for those who have seen this on the channel a good amount of times, this is nothing new. This is a Turbo Adnaz Najeela list, you know, really trying to lean into the things that this deck is starting to get known for, right? You're playing your tempo pieces, your things like Samut to draw you a bunch of cards. You got Lotho being one of the newest additions, you know, making you a bunch of treasures, helping Najeela cast, helping you play more spells in your deck. We have our 1-card win conditions here in Derevi and in our Grim Hirelings, and apart from that, you kind of pivot over when you're not rocking the Najeela plan pretty hard. You're trying to do things like having your intuition piles to get you your underworld breaches, or you're trying to jam an ad nauseum and trying to resolve things that way using your Final Fortunes and your Chance for Glories, tempo pieces that are going to take you turn by turn and allow you to really utilize the fact that Najeela is a quick deck, puts a lot of pressure on the field, puts a lot of pressure on the fact that there are 1-card win conditions that can come down at any time that are creature combos. You know, the deck is really, really solid at doing what it does, and it will continue to put up results. But yeah, nothing crazy spicy in this variant of the list, but, you know, classic Najeela stuff, turbo ad nauseum, 1-card combos with your commander, super lean commander, turning on swats and fierce guardianships and all of that stuff. So congrats to Aya, and the list is doing pretty well. We have Dogwater by Manila Midget. This is a name that we have said several times at these Mox Masters tournaments. We have this Dargo Thrasios list that Manila is known for playing, and it really, you know, a mid-range with a kick, I would argue, is this a strategy. It's like the Thrasios part of the deck with a little red covers the mid-range plan, but then sometimes you get these super explosive Dargo turns that really just pivot this game in your favor. One thing I've noticed in this list specifically, we have the Burgi for the pretty classic lines here, as well as Relic of Legends down here in the artifacts for multiple casts of Dargo, but I'm not actually seeing a Phyrexian Altar, which I feel like is something I'm pretty used to seeing with this deck, so that part's pretty interesting. We do have Goblin Bombardment here, so maybe that's sort of filling in the slot. I found that quite interesting because it does sack for damage, and I guess the idea is that it's a little more controlling than if we had the Phyrexian Altar there to make you mana. And then we have Greater Good here, which is obviously insane with Dargo. If you start getting those turns where you have like multiple red mana, you can start to, get your sacrifices down, end up scenarios where you're like draw 7, discard 3, draw 7, discard 3 for every single red mana that you have, and usually you're going to end up in a position where you're likely to win the game from that point. So Greater Good plus your commander is very, very solid. Another deck here, rocking the One Ring. It's a very solid mid-range piece. It's a very solid value piece, and in a deck like this that can pivot between explosive combo and in mid-range value, I think it's a really smart choice. But yeah, this deck's been doing pretty well lately and putting up really consistent results. For those who don't know, you can also Neoform your Dargo into a Tidespout Tyrant, which is a really easy way to win the game. This deck also takes really solid advantage of Displacer Kitten in a little like less understandably clean ways, but you can flicker your Dockside a lot, you can flicker your mana rocks, get those ready to go, cast multiple things off your spells, and as you can see here, there's a lot of non-creature spells in this deck, so it's pretty easy to play a Kitten and then really just start popping off. Very low lands for what I would consider, a Thrasios deck being a deck that you really want to have a decent amount of lands for, but this deck having the explosive side to it as well, so maybe not needing to play as many lands as once was thought of in this deck. But yeah, it's a pretty solid mid-range deck. Definitely has some spicy pieces here. Being able to have Eternal Witness and Endurance, I always find to be a little much in these Thrasios decks, but I know people really like Endurance for purposes of just getting your opponent, hosing them. Love seeing Wandering Archaic in the main board. I feel like it's, even in my own decks, pretty underplayed, so I've been nothing but happy whenever I resolve this card in one of my decks, and I've been suggesting it a lot for people trying to grind out a mid-range plan. Very cool deck here, very solid. I love how this deck really can just pivot once again between these Thrasios plans and these Dargo plans and just really start popping off with Dargo. So congrats to Manila on this list. Sharky's back here with Fool's Gold, this Crom Tevesh list that Sharky had a crazy run, I want to say about a couple months ago at this point, where they just like top 4, top 16, top 4 several tournaments, or won one of them as well. But yeah, this Turbo Adnaz Crom Tevesh deck that has like a mid-range slant to it. It can win with Hullbreaker Horror, but it also, once again, playing Ad Nauseam as one of the main win cons. You have these 2 5-mana commanders in the command zone, 27 lands. Like this deck is definitely like has aspects of greed to it, but Sharky keeps showing up and doing really well with this list. Defense Grid obviously helping to let your spells resolve, using pieces like Daze to really earn the tempo in your games. And also, if you're on a lower land count deck, it doesn't really hurt as much if you can just Daze and play your land again, for sure. There's definitely some really interesting stuff here, and a deck that is really built around sort of coming out of the gate swinging, right? Like when you have 2 5-mana value engine commanders, you're not trying to be subtle in what you're doing in these games. You're definitely trying to really go into it. But it also has some mid-range pieces and things like Opposition Agent and Bowmasters and Gilded Drake and Malevolent Hermit, which is actually really cool with Tevesh, because you can actually, sometimes what happens with Malevolent Hermit is you don't have anything you really want to counter with it, so it just sticks in the battlefield longer than you want to. But with Tevesh, you're like, okay, cool, I'll just draw 2 cards off of it, and then I can cast it for its Disturb side, and all my stuff can't be countered, which is pretty solid. It's a pretty cool list. I am very interested to see that Sharky seems to be the only one doing well with this specific combination of commanders. So I'm wondering if there's any other pilots out here who think they could take this Tevesh Crom list to a big W. So congrats to Sharky, and nice job on another top 16 with this list. We have Infinite Humility by Arab Prince 123 playing one of my first tournament commanders, Elsha of the Infinite. I have not seen Elsha put up a result in a really long time, and it's super cool to see this deck do well at this tournament. In general, I feel like Elsha's been in a really tough spot in the format, and I'm seeing a lot of new pieces in this deck that hopefully can give this deck a bit of a booster shot, because I personally adore Elsha. I've really loved this deck for a long time, and as I mentioned, it has sort of a sentimental place in my heart because it's one of the first decks I ever did pretty decently at a sort of tournament weekend. So pretty cool list, and let's break it down. We got Teferi here, which is not a traditional piece in these decks, and Tezzeret the Seeker. These planeswalkers, once again, a lot of value. You can flash them into instant speed, although Teferi at instant speed much more impactful than a Tezzeret at instant speed. Teferi being able to, at end step, oh hey, Teferi's on top of my library, let's just cast that, and then suddenly my turn is uninteractable. I do like seeing Elsha being on pieces like this that really stop your opponents from, messing up your game plan, because it is decently easy in certain points to have people just really have every counter in the world. Classic Elsha situation here where we have two creatures because trying to take full advantage of Elsha's abilities. Traditionally, Ethereum Sculptor is played over Burgi, but I guess since the printing of Burgi, it's a card that has some flexibility to it. I believe you can cast the backside off of Elsha as well, and the spell has definitely got a lot going for it, and it fills the same role as Ethereum Sculptor despite costing one more, but then it also has a lot more application throughout the rest of the deck. For those who don't know, you want to get Elsha, a card like Burgi and Sensei's Divining Top, to be able to draw your entire deck, because every time you are casting the top off the top of your library, it is actually netting you the 1 mana you need to recast the top when you draw with it again. So Elsha and top, obviously very strong. This list is also playing Helm of Awakening, which I find it interesting prioritizing here this Helm of Awakening, which makes all your stuff cost 1 generic mana less, where I would think an Ethereum Sculptor would be more of a priority despite being, a creature spell. It's a little tough to see Helm, which can definitely throw the game. This is a card that I've definitely seen King make, and it's definitely a scary card to let your opponents have on the battlefield. I like the addition of Imposter Mech. As I mentioned, we're getting a lot of cards here that, weren't in the traditional Elsha list. Pentad Prism, one of my favorite includes in the deck. I have been saying for a long time that I think this card is super underrated. I think it's a really good piece for allowing you the ability to explode, right? If you are using Pentad Prism and you're paying 2 mana into it, the next turn you can untap and crack the 2 counters on it, and suddenly you went from having 3 mana on turn 3 to 5 mana on turn 3, which is a big difference, especially when you have a 5 mana commander in the command zone. Cool seeing that tech here. We have Cloud Key here, another reducer of Sensei's top. We have Reservoir, which I'm assuming is this pilot's way of finishing the game in a clean way. You can Sensei's top until you get your Reservoir in the battlefield, or you can go through the Sensei's loop until you can do Breach and stuff like that. Reservoir being a payoff for any of those. It's the first time I've ever seen an Unwinding Clock in Elsha, but I like it as far as being able to, affect the top of your library, to be able to move stuff. This is another deck featuring the new One Ring, and artifact favored decks are definitely gonna like this. One thing I think that notable in this deck is that this deck is very much gonna feed your Dockside Extortionist from your opponents, so that is a card you should probably be a little afraid of. I would definitely think about a card like Stern Scolding for this list, just because of how much it feeds Dockside. Deck's playing Otherworldly Gaze, which is really interesting as a way to reset the top of your library. I'm kind of surprised that this is the card of choice, because I feel like there are better options that are available out there, but very cool to see Gaze on the top there. Bribery, not a card very often played in cEDH, but in a deck where you're playing almost no creatures, feels like a pretty solid way to steal them from your opponents. Another interesting piece here is the addition of Thought Lash, which does fix the top card of your library. It is for 0, basically you can exile 1 card, so it is sort of like your blue Necropotence for this deck. I've never seen that as Elsha tech, and I think it's pretty spicy. I think it really just adds a lot of value to the list, and now that I'm noticing down here, we're down to 24 lands in this Elsha deck, which is way more than the traditional list used to play. But as I mentioned, if you're playing stuff off the top of your library, you want to have a nice clean low curve, because you want to be able to just cast a ton of spells. Elsha does some crazy stuff, especially when you start casting spells in response to your other spells and gaining things with Reservoir, stuff like that. So yeah, Elsha definitely provides you a ton of value. I love seeing the new tech in here. We got Spiteful Banditry as well. Kind of interesting that you can bribery someone Thassa's Oracle and then use Thought Lash to exile your whole deck with that. So a lot of really spicy, cool cards in this list. I like that it's playing some atypical pieces you're not used to seeing in cEDH, and definitely taking advantage of a lot of the new tech cards like the One Ring, stuff like that. So congrats to this pilot on a really cool Elsha list, and congrats on making it top 16 with a deck that has not done so in quite some time. We have Dihada cEDH by Tailspin. Now, when I saw Dihada in this top 16, I just sort of assumed it was going to be the Mardu Turbo Nas Dihada that's been popping up everywhere. But that's not what this specific Dihada list is. This list is much more focused on value pieces. It's much more focused on graveyards. It's a pretty cool Dihada list, so let's talk about it. For those who don't know, Dihada has picked up a lot of steam lately. It's been a card that people have been doing a lot of work with, especially those associated with Eminence, and there's been some interesting developments that have come out. Basically, the card Flicker plus Dihada is a combo that allows you to mill 4, make 4 treasures, and then Flicker only costs 2 of those treasures, so basically you're netting a card every time you go through that loop and netting 2 mana, which is pretty solid and kind of turns Dihada into a solid Underworld Breach enabler in the command zone. So all you really need is Breach and Flicker, and then you've got yourself a win con. Yeah, there's a lot of really crazy stuff here. Now, for a little more context, context, Dihada has been popping off lately because of how explosive it can be, right? The ability for it to generate that mana right away is very, very solid. Plus, it gets access to white, which is a lot of people's, theories in the deck, is that you can just flash a silence very early in the game before your opponents are prepared to answer a silence and you're trying to go for the win, right? So that's kind of the theory behind this deck as far as I'm aware. But this list definitely way more into the value grind side of it. We've got crazy cards here like Dark Confidant, which I've been saying is underrated for a little bit, but really cool to actually see it in a black mid-range list. We got Valky here, which is also Tibalt. It's a legendary that Dehata can pull out of the graveyard, and also, the Tibalt side is going to give you a lot of value. We have things like Mind Sensors, template your opponents, the new Boromir, which I didn't think was really going to be a Dehata card for sure. Now we have Braids, which I really like because Braids can start sacrificing treasures to make your opponent sacrifice their real artifacts, which is very, very solid, and if they don't do that, they can start giving you cards. So definitely a solid value engine in this list. We have Drawn on Linvala, slowing down your opponent's creature combos. We have Yawgmoth, which I don't know if there's any explicit combos in the deck, so I'd be curious to hear if there's anything with Yawgmoth. And then Abdel Adrian, who, for those who don't know, you can actually do something similar to what you would do with World Gorger Dragon. With Abdel, when it comes into the battlefield through an effect of something like a Necromancy, Dance of the Dead, Animate Dead, something like that, when it comes to the battlefield, its ETB will happen, and you can actually choose to exile one of those effects. And when you do that, they have little sacrifice clauses that say then you have to sacrifice Abdel. And what can happen here is you can then flicker all of your non-land permanents infinitely, and you can make infinite 1/1s, you can make infinite mana if you have any sort of mana rocks in the battlefield, and that's kind of how that combo works. This deck going all the way up to Elesh Norns, both of them. Obviously, one-sided Elesh Norn Mother Machines allows cards like Dockside to get out of hand very, very quickly, and then 7-mana Elesh Norn, solid value engine, definitely a beater, not going to let your opponents get away with having much there as far as that's concerned. But yeah, this is a really interesting list because it has a lot of like mid-range pieces, it has a lot of value pieces, but at the end of the day, it's still, going along the line of that Dihada wants to go along, which is trying to be fast and underneath what other people are doing. But this one definitely eschewing classic Turbo Nas style wins here, where there's no Turbo Nas in this list, and instead choosing to go for these like Reanimator Abdel Adrian lines and still keep the Underworld Breach synergies, which is super solid, but definitely choosing to play some more interesting pieces in the 99 that do not do what we're used to seeing from this deck. We have Wood Tier Ari with TK stacks, Timna Kodama. This is a Timna Kodama mid-range stacks deck. It is a Protean Hulk list. It has the cEDH lines, which I cannot explain because I do not know them that well, but I know for a fact that there is some reanimation stuff you can do where you get your cEDH out and then create a chain where you don't actually have to cast spells and you win somehow. I've never played this version of the deck and actually feel relatively ignorant as far as like knowing exactly how the deck wins, but aside from that, there is Acerak, the Aether Lich combos, and I'm curious to see if they are on Allurin. So Acerak plus Allurin is a 2-card combo there because you can start bouncing Acerak and go through the dungeon that allows you to drain your opponents out. We have the classic, Protean Hulk style packages here. We have Birthing Pod lines, and I think that has something to do with cEDH as well. As I mentioned, if anyone knows those cEDH lines, that'd be lovely if you could throw them down in the comments below, because I have not studied them. I know they exist. I know the fact that like cEDH plus something or other just sort of allows you to like 1-card combo with Kodama in the command zone. So I know it's a thing. I don't know exactly how to execute it, but it seems pretty solid. And then apart from that, yeah, we're looking at like kind of a creature combo Abzan mid-range deck, taking advantage of a lot of rule of law effects, the classic stacks pieces like Mind Sensor and Thalia, things like that. So definitely a solid deck, and definitely not one that I was expecting. I think it has a lot of atypical pieces in it, and it's got a lot of really unique stuff in here. So really cool deck, and definitely one a bit off the beaten path, which is pretty solid. Here we have a little bit more of a classic Dihada list, and by classic I mean this is still like only a few months old deck right now, but yeah, this is the turbo Dihada. So this is a lot more leaning into the ad nauseum strategies. This is a Dihada leaning into Bolo's Citadel strategies, taking advantage of out of time, which is when your commander is a planeswalker and you can one-sided wrath the board in a way that means that no one's getting their creatures, no one's getting dies triggers, just removes them all from play for like usually 8 or 9 turns. Pretty solid at that, and very solid against the stacks matchups that are existing in the format right now. Even though this is a more aggressive deck where they're still on the One Ring, this card is becoming quite popular in this format, and I think it's going to be one that sticks around for a while because it is just genuinely, like, it feels like a Ristic study as far as like, oh, just a value card draw staple in the format, which is crazy because it's a colorless card. So the One Ring, definitely a card that is going to be sticking around, definitely a solid piece for cEDH right now. But yeah, the rest of this deck is doing a lot of crazy Turbo Nas, milling type of stuff. You play Dihada, you get your Flicker, it's the one card combo, you know, as we talked about the last time. But this one playing crazy cards like Last Chance and Warrior's Oath and really diving deep into the Turbo Nas style of the strategy. Magda's pretty solid too, because if you get just a single treasure more than Dihada's down tick, you can then pull out your Bolus's Citadel from your deck, which is obviously very solid when you're playing this super aggressive Turbo Nauseam deck. 24 lander definitely feels appropriate for the kind of aggro deck game plan that this deck is going for. So super solid. Glad to see, you know, all of the hype about Mardu Summer is paying off with these Dihada lists showing up and making the top 16. We have Mox Masters July by Pontus. This is a super interesting deck, to be honest. This is a Tymna Dargo list. It is like really interestingly like a hybrid deck between like classic turbo Tymna Mardu stuff plus a decent amount of random synergy with Dargo, which is pretty cool. Yeah, it's got a lot of cool stuff here. Now Dargo being really solid in these style decks because it turns cards like Burnt Offering or Sacrifice and gives you 7 mana with your Dargo, which is like either casting your Peer into the Abyss, you're casting your Ad Nauseams, casting your Bolus's Citadel. So when you have Dargo and you know, when a fast turbo style strategy wants to be sacrificing a lot of permanents anyways, it's trying to crack your treasures, it's cracking your LEDs, all that stuff. So you get your Dargo down super early and then hit it with a Burnt Offering, and then all of a sudden you're making a ridiculous amount of mana, and a deck like a turbo Ad Nauseam style deck is trying to explode as soon as it gets amount of mana. So that part's pretty solid. This deck is really cool. It's got a lot of, you know, dorky creatures there for Tymna. It's got, you know, Dockside Plan, it's got Lotho, which, you know, insta staple in the format. We have Ruthless Technomancer lines that I cannot explain for the life of me, but I know that some people know how to explain these. And yeah, it's a pretty solid list. I know I had been sort of looking at a Tymna Dargo shell, but for me that was more like a Hordling Broodmaster shell, but it looks pretty interesting. I really like the inclusion of Ob Nixilis here too. Yeah, so with Dargo on the battlefield, you can actually play Ob Nixilis, sacrifice it to its casualty ability, and then immediately draw 7 cards and lose 7 life because of its ultimate. So definitely a pretty solid synergy there as well. This deck's got a lot of really cool pieces. I like it, and it definitely, I think, is one of those decks that, you know, you see the same turbo ad nauseam strategies over and over again. It gets kind of boring, but this deck definitely, I think, throws in enough new cool pieces, a lot of spicy stuff here, that it turns out it's pretty cool. So congrats to Pontus for this performance. We have another Mox Masters top 16 by Shalai and Halar. Got another one going in here. This one definitely taking a lot of examples of what Stefan and Razor was doing with their list last time. A lot of cards that say, you know, my combo pieces get protection from what you're trying to do, which is remove my pieces. Then playing a bunch of mid-rangey pieces here, things like stacks pieces like Rip and Blind Obedience and Deafening Silence, all pieces like that that are going to guarantee that when you get your combo, it's ready to go. Savage Summoning obviously being one of the best cards in any Shalai Halar list because it's flashing in your creatures uncounterably. The creatures can't be countered either, and it's putting the 1/1 counter on these creatures that allows you to start comboing off of Shalai and Halar. So definitely super solid piece with any Shalai and Halar list. For those who don't remember, the main win cons are cards like the Red Terror, which says, you know, whenever you deal damage to an opponent, a red source specifically, you can put a 1 counter on the Terror, which then triggers Halar again, Shalai, and then it goes back and forth, pinging your opponents to death. We have Emil Dockside combos, and for those who don't know, the reason this works is because Emil's second clause says whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you can pay a green or a white, and you can put a 1/1 counter on them. So after you've created infinite mana, you can start going through the loop again and putting a 1/1 counter on Dockside every time it comes in. Therefore, Schleinhar sees the 1 damage, pings your opponent, and kills them. Pretty solid. Very happy to see that this deck has evolved. I know there were some early versions, including the version we saw on this very channel when I did the live deck tech for it. Definitely a few adaptations that I really like. A lot of the pieces to protect your win con, especially definitely making it sure that when you're going for your creature combo, you're getting there. And definitely not as hard stacks pieces, which I think is just the way to do it. You definitely want to be able to do your multiple casts. You want to be able to grab your legendary thing, play it right away, but still play these pieces like Linvala and things like that that really slow your opponents down, hurt them pretty badly, and grant you enough time so that you can then get there with your combos. So super solid. Glad to see another July Halar. Glad to see this commander did not just fade into oblivion after the first initial versions of it. It seems pretty solid and pretty cool. So congrats to this pilot. Now, before we go into the top 4 of this video, I want to remind you that we are affiliated with Monarch Media, and Mythic Lotus Gaming is going to be putting on Lotuscon October 7th through 8th in Belleville, Illinois. It's going to be a crazy cEDH event. I have been tweeting about it for a month now. It's going to be insane. I think there's so many cool things to go just as a player of Magic, and especially as a cEDH player. There's a crazy tournament, time twister at the top, thousands of dollars for the top 4. You even get paid out to the top 32, not to mention crazy perks at the actual vicinity, including, you know, the fact that the tattoo artist who did my Kiki Jiki and my Duskull and my Mimikyu, that artist will be at this convention doing magic tattoos for people, along with 2 other artists, I believe. So there's gonna be a ton of crazy stuff over at Lotuscon. I'm so thrilled to go there. I'm super grateful that Monarch is allowing me to get out there and participate in this event, in the big cEDH tournament that's gonna be there. It's gonna be so exciting, and I'd love to see people there. It's gonna be crazy. Into our top 4, we have 5-color Cope Queen by J1VA. This is a Najeela Turbo Nas list. We're seeing it a lot nowadays. It's a really good deck. I argued that it's either the best or second best deck in the format right now. Just putting up result after result after result, you know, saying, hey, we don't even need the old ways. We don't need your Nature's Will or your Druid's Repository. Pfft, we got Derevi, we got Grim Hireling, and then the rest of the game plan doing Underworld Breach shenanigans, you know, popping off with your Turbo Ad Nauseum style strategies, using your Chancellor Glories and your Final Fortunes to gain your tempo, and then playing 5 colors, solid cards, a lot of cards that are just better because you get access to every single color. And despite Najeela not having card advantage in the command zone, the card quality of your deck is so high, and you get to play a Turbo Nas strategy, which is one of the best ways to be attacking the format right now, on top of a creature strategy that has 1-card win conditions in it. Najeela comes down super early, gains you a ton of advantage. Like, there's nothing more terrifying in a game of cEDH than a turn 1 Najeela on the play, but it happens a lot, and I think this deck is scary for that very reason. It's not unbeatable, but it's solid, and it's gonna keep showing up, and it's gonna keep putting up numbers. We have another Dargo Thrasios combo mid-range, this time by Freedom Waffle, who is a name you should be familiar with because they have been putting up result after result with this Dargo Thrasios list. Freedom been doing a great job. A player I really respect. They've been playing this deck very well. You know, I think during one of the Mox Masters, they were literally my only losses for the entire tournament. So Freedom definitely playing super solid over and over again, making consistent results with this Dargo Thrasios list. As we talked about earlier in the video, we're talking about Dargo and Thrasios. Thrasios being the mid-range grind engine, and Dargo being the I win explode button. And this list, I don't know how many differences it really has from the one we looked at earlier today. This one also off of Phyrexian Altar, not even on Goblin Bombardment. So the sack outlet plan in this version of the list seems to be very low priority. There's no Burgi here either. So it seems like that whole game plan of, you know, play Dargo, sacrifice it to a sacrifice effect, and then try and recur that loop over and over again, looks like that is not even a part of the main game plan of this deck. We're not even seeing Relic of Legends here, which is sort of like a Thrasios Dargo staple. This one definitely leaning into the birthing pod effects, the Neoform effects, trying to turn your Dargo into a Tidespout Tyrant, trying to use Displacer Kitten to combo off with Dockside and Eternal Witness and things like that. Definitely a lot of really cool stuff in this list. Definitely a mid-range deck with explosive potential that really adds a lot to the play patterns of this list. There are certain lists that lean heavier into Thrasios, there are certain lists that lean heavier into other partners as well, but this is definitely a Thrasios list with a kiss of Dargo, and that Dargo kiss being a lot of explosive potential, especially when it comes to cards like we talked about earlier, like Greater Good or Birthing Pod, etc. Another one ring deck too, worth mentioning. We have Snaky Is Kuza here with Snake Nimrus V5. Nimrus making the top 4 of a cEDH tournament. This is a name I have been, you know, I think myself and Callahan from the Mind Sculptors have been talking about how Nimrus is super underrated, and I'm super happy to see it see play here. It's a deck that I truly, thoroughly enjoy. I think it leads to really fun games, really fun play patterns. You know, you're encouraged to hold up mana and respond to the table. You're encouraged to be an active player in the game, basically. So I really like Nimrus for that very reason, and I'm wildly stoked to see it here in the top 4 of this tournament. It is not a deck I expected to see in the top 4, but That's super, super cool. New additions to the deck being like Fairy Mastermind, Bow Masters too. These are all flash enablers that also give you triggers for your Nimrus. Kind of wild to see a Sheoldred here in this deck. I was a little bit surprised by this one. So when it enters, each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature or planeswalker, and then you pay 5 and it flips over and it destroys up to 1 target creature or planeswalker they control. Each opponent discards 3, then mills 3, and then put all creatures from your graveyard on the battlefield under your control. I'm not really sure why this is in here, to be honest. I feel like this feels like a typo maybe to me from the actual Sheoldred, but I genuinely, like, if you flip over the other side, it gives you a ton of value. But definitely would love to hear if anyone has any idea why this card is in this deck. Would be super cool. Love seeing Deluge and Languish. Creature combo decks are really taking over the format, especially in Mox Masters. I've noticed that they are really aggressively showing up in there. So having double board wipe for that situation is pretty solid. You know, a lot of other stuff here. No ad nauseum in this Nimrus list. Definitely much more of a tempo style Nimrus deck. I know that's sort of been a debate with the deck for a long time. Born Upon the Wind, super cool addition to this deck. Definitely a piece that is going to allow you to win at instant speed, which is, you know, we talked about many times now that that's a pretty solid way to play the game. We have Visions of Beyond here as well. If a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you draw 3 instead of drawing 1. Very interested to hear about the inclusion of this one as well. Not usually my first consideration, but maybe it's just an instant speed draw effect that turns into a draw 2 with your commander. Shadow of Doubt, a card that I feel like people talked about a lot when I started playing cEDH and then never actually played, so kind of cool to see it here. Yeah, this is definitely a solid Nimrus flash tempo list. Oh, Dystopia. I don't even know what this does. Accumulate upkeep 1 life during each player's upkeep. If that player controls any green or white permanents, they sacrifice a green or white permanent. Oh, this is just green white creature hate. So yeah, this deck really, you know, saying I'm gonna start hating on the creatures of the format pretty solidly, and I, you know, just have a few pieces here that that survive a lot of the things that we're trying to do. So yeah, this is a pretty cool list. I like seeing what it's got going here. Definitely really solid, and congrats to our pilot here for taking a deck that a lot of people overlooked to the top 4 of this tournament. It's pretty cool to see a Nimrus here. We have a 2-time Mox Masters winner, with Pauper Fanatic taking down the tournament again, twice in a row, with no good cards, their Tayam list. It is crazy to see not only a Tayam deck take down a tournament, but a Tayam deck piloted by the same pilot take down 2 Mox Masters events in a row. This deck is just really starting to pop off. It's wild how it went from a deck that nobody was talking about to a deck people are talking about respecting a lot, and it's still able to pop off and win in these games. I'm a little bit surprised that these decks are not adding Rosy Cotton to be able to combo off with Scurry Oak. I feel like it's just sort of a free combo in the deck. I know it's not like insanely crazy, but I don't know, for some reason I feel like it's pretty solid in this list. But yeah, it's a lot of the stuff that we covered on the deck tech of time that we did on this very video. There's not a crazy amount of different cards from this list to the one we talked about, but definitely some of the newer innovations in the Tayam builds, and, you know, Bowmasters being one of the most recent new additions. This deck really doesn't care about drawing a ton, so it's very interesting to be able to hate on decks that are trying to draw a bunch of cards. This deck also playing Collector Oof, which I've heard in the Tayam Discord there's a lot of debate between, like, is Collector Oof good for the deck? It doesn't matter that our main win condition is an artifact based one, and it's very interesting to see Collector Oof back in the main list of these Tayam decks. Halfling, obviously super solid for getting you a Tayam uncounterable on the battlefield. And yeah, Tayams are, for some reason, they just keep getting there. I mean, the deck's very solid. Once again, like we talked about this before, it can win through a rule of law. It can win at instant speed. It does a lot of stuff really well, and if you start really utilizing the stuff that it does well, Tayam can be super strong, and we have a pilot who clearly is devoted to this deck, showing up and winning 2 tournaments in a row. Absolutely crazy. What do y'all think about this? What do you think about the Tayam dominance? What do you think about the fact that there's been a lot of really cool decks here? We're seeing a resurgence of Dargo Thrasios, seeing Tayam take down a whole tournament, a Nimrus in the top 4. This has got to be one of the most unique top 16s we've had in a really long time. And there's so many cool things to report about from this tournament. I'd love to hear people's thoughts in the comments of this video. Thank you all for watching. Remember, while you're here on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe. It helps out the channel a ton, and it's super awesome when y'all do. It makes it so that I can keep trying to make this channel my full-time thing. A reminder, I also do cEDH coaching. If you want coaching from a player who's had many top 16s under his belt, many top 4s, and at least one tournament win, feel free to check out that. You can email me at comedianmtg@gmail.com. You can always hit me up on Twitter or Discord as well. And you can also check out our Patreon at patreon.com/comedianmtg if you want to support the channel in that way, including our coaching tier. If you're interested in that, you can check that out, and we'll leave that in the description down below. But without any further ado, I want to thank some of my amazing patrons who are in this next card. Peace.
I can feel the blood creeping up from the heathens. Got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gonna feed them. If you're coming for me, hope you're ready for a demon. I got eyes in the back of my head, I'm seeing. Take me for granted and you know I'm leaving. I'ma take what's mine with the webs I'm weaving. I could take this crowd from seeing to believing. Got a taste for